Hello and welcome to another one of our videos on the Scottish Wars of Independence. This video deals with the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, specifically the events of day 2 of the battle. The aim of today's video is to learn about the key events of the Battle of Bannockburn, and by the end of it we should be able to describe how events unfolded during the battle. We should be able to explain the significance of the battlefield and how the battle itself was fought, and be able to explain why Bruce's tactics were so much more effective than those employed by the English on day 2 of the battle. Although this video is accessible to anyone with interest in the Scottish Wars of Independence, for students of high history and National 5 history, they're reminded that you should take notes of the information that appears in bold to build up your knowledge of the course as we go through the video, and annotate your own maps of the battle as the tale of the battle unfolds. Finally, we get an opportunity to use what you've learned across the 2 Bannockburn videos to attempt today's big question at the end of today's video. So to begin, a recap of the events of Bannockburn Day 1 as covered in our previous video. Bruce's army had the advantage of waiting for the approaching English just southeast of Stirling. He had positioned his forces by the King's Park, hiding his schiltrons of infantry in the New Park forest. Bruce himself had been caught out in the open, organising his troops as the English appeared on the road in the evening of the 23rd of June 1314, and the English vanguard, led by the young Sir Henry de Bohun, had charged across the field to try and take out the king. As shown in the image here, Bruce had heroically stood his ground against the charging knight and had taken the young man down to the cheers of his army. To support their king, the Scottish infantry had charged from the forest to engage the oncoming English knights, who were held and then set to fleeing. Meanwhile, Sir Thomas Mowbray had ran off to meet his schiltron of soldiers, holding the road at St Ninians up to Stirling to stop a flanking manoeuvre by the English under Sir Robert Clifford. His schiltron also held the advancing English knights and turned them back. Arriving as they did later in the day, Edward did not deploy his army for a battle, lest they run out of daylight, and he moved east towards the Carse, just around the gorge of the Bannockburn, to camp his soldiers on low-lying ground for the night. Bruce's army, we are told, had considered leaving the field, melting away into the darkness, faced as they were by quite massive odds, his army being outnumbered perhaps as much as 4-1 by the English, when Sir Alexander Seaton defected from the English ranks and came across to the Scots and told them of the low morale of the English army. At that point, Bruce resolved to stay, hold the battlefield, and fight the next day. Day 2 of the battle, 24th of June, 1314. At dawn, Bruce gave the order to attack the English. Disciplined lines of Scottish pikemen emerged from the tree line of the New Park, moving down onto the Carse to form up into 3 large schiltrons. The majority of the Scottish knights, Bruce's best fighters, dismounted, unlike the English knights who stayed on horseback, and they joined the front ranks of the pikemen. This was a key move by Bruce. If you recall, by this stage, Bruce and his army had successfully been campaigning together since 1307, and they had known very little defeat during this period. Working together as an effective fighting unit, these men knew what they were doing. They were well prepared for this fight. By Bruce opting to use his knights as a heavily armoured line of shock troops at the front of the schiltron, he put his best fighters with the fighting would be the most intense. Bruce knew to put his knights on horseback against a far numerically superior English force would be to waste them and to throw them away. Having the knights fight on foot meant they would be an effective addition to the Scottish army. Before the battle began, the whole army then knelt as the Bishop of Arbroath and other important Scottish clerics blessed the army using the sacred relics of St Columba. Now, medieval armies often did this before battle, be blessed by the priests to put the soldiers' minds at ease lest it not go well. This is a method of psychological warfare. encouraged the soldiers to believe that God was truly on their side. Now, this item, the silver casket shown on the right, is the Monymusk reliquary. Now, it is believed to date back to the early medieval period, so several centuries before Bruce is around himself, and it supposedly contained relics of Saint Columba, Scotland's first patron saint, who died in 597 AD. Now, saints almost had totemic, almost supernatural powers associated with their relics, which means basically, yes, the remains of their bodies. So the Monymusk reliquary is said to have contained the finger bones of St. Columba. Now, whether or not they were still in there by the time that Bruce's troops kneeled in front of the Bishop of Arbroath in this reliquary, it's unknown. The reliquary itself still survives, so students of history can go and visit it, gaze upon it at the National Museum of Scotland, and wonder what used to be inside. King Edward mistook the Scots kneeling for prayer as begging for mercy. He was said to be amazed that the Scots would actually meet him in battle. Now, it's easy to understand Edward II's viewpoint, even though it is, to us, appears possibly a bit arrogant in hindsight. He has arrived at this battlefield with an army that is as much as 4 times larger than the Scots. The previous battle, where the Scots actually showed up for the fight, of a major scale, was the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, where Wallace's army was roundly defeated by an English force that outnumbered it perhaps 2 to 1. So Edward believes that the odds are firmly stacked in his favour at the onset of day 2 of the battle. So we can understand why he is surprised that the Bruce has stuck around for the fight. As the English scrambled to form up and engage with what was now Bruce's rapidly advancing army, there was a brief exchange of bow fire between the archers of the two sides, to which the Scots suffered most. If you remember, the English at this date in history are using the longbow, which is an extremely effective weapon on the medieval battlefield. It has far longer range than your standard bow, and it has enough punch to penetrate plate armour. So it's in the Scots' interest to close the distance between the two armies as quickly as possible to limit the damage raining down on them from these English archers. So now we're going to use maps to explain the flow of the battle and what happened on the day. Now this carries on from our video of day 1 of the battle. So students of our history are recommended to take a blank copy of the map, and we're going to annotate it now with the different unit formations and the actions they took on the battlefield to create a diagram of what happened on the day. So first things first is to get your 2 colours that are going to represent the 2 different sides so that we can clearly see who is doing what, and we're going to annotate our maps with a key. Now this is adding to the key from our Bannockburn Day 1 video. But here we go. So we know from the previous video that Bruce had placed pot traps or pit traps around the roads that crossed the Bannockburn. These would have been fairly obvious to the English scouts and cavalry as they're kind of riding past, but obviously they would have narrowed down the English forces who would not have wanted to risk their horses being maimed going across these pot traps, and they would have made the progression of a large force across the burn at that point quite exposed to Scottish attack, either by a frontal charge or by raking their column with archers. This is what modern historians believe forced Edward II to lead his army off to the east to try and camp and then make a crossing at the Bannockburn in the boggy mass of the Carse. Now, Bruce's deployment on day 2 of the battle. So with dawn, we have Sir Robert Keith and Sir James Douglas, Bruce's rapid reaction cavalry force at the foot of Coxet Hill. Maurice Shiltram is on the edge of the trees in the new park, as is Edward Bruce's Shiltram. Bruce's Shiltram takes the centre. The small folk, Bruce's camp followers, The new recruits who'd come down from the Highlands to support Bruce's cause in the face of an English advance. These are kept to the back of Coxet Hill, out of the main danger of being involved in the initial clash of combat and guarding the Scottish baggage. Now, how does the battle unfold from here? So the Earl of Gloucester, who'd been given command of the army by Edward II. So you remember from the first video, Edward II has taken the extremely unusual step of not commanding his own army as a king. He's instead chosen to fight as a normal knight in the ranks to prove his valour, to prove his courage going toe-to-toe with the enemy, which is commendable, but not great in basically establishing a clear chain of command in his army. He's also overlooked the veteran Earl of Hereford, who had been a commander under Edward II's father, Edward I, and instead given the command to the young and upcoming Earl of Gloucester. And this causes a lot of disdain, dispute within the nobles in Edward's army, and also confuses the line of command. Do the soldiers look to their old commanders that they've been used to for years, or are they supposed to look to these newly appointed nobles under Edward II? So you see the Earl of Gloucester there, forming up his line of cavalry at the front of English force. So please mark this onto your maps. Edward II is fighting with them at the east end of the formation. Or often in medieval or even ancient warfare, the charge happened not in one flat straight line, but in something called an echelon. So you almost imagine like a diagonal line of forces charging across the battlefield. And the end of the line that would contact first would often be the right-hand side. So this is why Edward has placed himself there in the place of honour. This is where they imagined the first contact would be made between the two armies. Now you can see behind them, most of the English infantry, including the bulk of their archers, are still on the wrong side of the Bannockburn. They've camped to the east of it during the night, just purely because of a lack of space. So we can see them lined out in the battlefield here. So the shapes with F in them represent foot soldiers, and the triangles represent the English archers, squeezed in where they could at the sides of the infantry formations. So Gloucester's ad hoc formation was pressed from behind that morning by his own foot soldiers, who are coming across the Bannockburn, getting ready to set up for the fight that is surely coming very quickly, pushing forward, trying to make space, and basically unsettling the knights as they try to line up their chargers, ready to take a formation and begin the battle. Edward's knights are also threatened by the advancing Scots, who suddenly raise up from being blessed by the priests, and instead of sitting and waiting on the top of the hill for the English to charge in at them, as Edward thoroughly expected them to do so, the Scots mounted their own charge. Now, for an infantry force, this is bordering on unthinkable. Infantry force's strength is based on the fact that they hold a tight formation. The spears basically are intended to stop cavalry charges just rolling over them, because a horse will not charge directly onto something that it knows is going to hurt itself. So holding formation, shoulder to shoulder, a force of spears pointing forwards, is the best way for infantrymen to stay safe on the battlefield. For them to give up that tight formation by breaking out into a charge is going to dumbfound the English. So Gloucester's only real option, faced by a charge down the hill from Bruce's Scots, was to lead a mass charge of his own. But the advancing Scots were almost upon them by the time Gloucester is able to give the signal to his disorganised force. And from this point, the English are really, really on the back foot. They've also absolutely learned nothing from day one of the battle. Day one, if you remember, English knights in the vanguard had charged across the field to try and catch out Bruce, and had been caught themselves by Scottish infantry charging out with the force to support the king. It's Ninians as well, a second English cavalry force under Clifford that had tried to charge past Sir Philip Mowbray's infantry Shiltram, had likewise been held and had been unable to penetrate the spears. The English knights are trying to do exactly the same thing on day two. So learning nothing from the two previous encounters the previous day, the English cavalry were unable to get past the densely packed Scottish spears. They are brought to a standstill. One of the key benefits of knights on the medieval battlefield is the fact that they can pick up incredible momentum on a charge. A wall of horsemen charging down on infantry is just a mass of muscle and momentum and weight bearing down on you. Even if their lance doesn't kill you, then the weight of that charger basically running over the top of you is almost equally likely to be deadly. If you rob knights of that momentum, then you take away basically their best weapon, the charge. The knights still have the advantage of being higher and being able to smash down on the heads of infantry, but against a forest of spears that are all poking up at them and their horses, the knights themselves create a much larger target than an individual infantryman, and they suddenly find themselves very, very vulnerable without the benefit of speed. So the English cavalry were unable to get past the densely packed Scottish spears once the two sides engaged. So separated from his knights and early casualties, the Earl of Gloucester, the leader of the English army. He was amongst the first to die as he was pulled from his horse by a Scottish infantryman. Now, note that the tight nature of the battlefield, as you can see with it unfolding in the first stages of day 2 here, Edward's army is hemmed in. Now, even though it outnumbers Bruce's force by as much as 4-1, they've got nowhere to go. To the left and behind them, they have the Bannockburn, which, although it is a burn, a stream, sits in a deep gorge surrounded by gorse and undergrowth. It is a difficult obstacle to cross for infantry, never mind armoured knights on horseback. To the east of them, they've got the Pelstream Burn, which likewise sits in quite a deep gorge. So Edward's army has no space to spread out. This is one of the key factors to why their cavalry was taken on the hop. Now, with Bruce charging down from the hill, where the good dry land is to stage a battle, the English army find themselves basically hemmed in on 4 sides. They've got nowhere to go. So trapped at the rear, some English archers eventually managed to make their way around the eastern end of the Scottish line. From there, and this potentially would be deadly to the Scottish army, they're able to rain arrows down onto Bruce's exposed flank. This would cause heavy casualties amongst the tightly packed spearmen. Now, in the tight press of battle, with the men in the back ranks pushing their way into the men at the front in order to hold just a muscle mass of that wall of English knights, there is no way that soldiers hemmed in are going to be able to haul their shields up and protect themselves from arrows raining down on them. So unless Bruce can counter this threat of English archers, he faces watching his army just unravel behind him as he's engaging with those English knights. So this is a deadly threat to the Scottish force. But Bruce has planned ahead. Bruce had held Sir Robert Keith in reserve, waiting for just such an attack. He knew the Scottish cavalry are no use going head to head with English cavalry. They've got light horses, they don't have as much armour, and they don't have as many numbers as English knights. So he uses them in a different way. Instead, they're going to be a rapid reaction force to plug any gaps in his line and also to deal with any emerging threats, just like this. So Keith rode into the archer formation with his 500 light cavalry. Now, archers are great at pouring fire down onto a densely packed formation, but when they have fast-moving light cavalry spaced out, bearing down on them, the archers at best have got time to get off 1 or 2 shots, and even then, they're probably going to be panicking. Their aim will suffer, and then they're just going to be mowed down. These men are not heavily armed, and they're not good at hand-to-hand combat. That's not where their skill set lies. So these archers are brushed aside by Sir Robert Keith as he pounds in. Now, students of higher history should now take a new blank map. So much is happening on our maps, it's going to get too confused if we keep annotating the one map. So I'm going to ask you to take a third map now. Map 1 is going to cover day 1 of the battle. Your second map is covering the initial stages of day 2, which we've just gone through. And then we're going to annotate a third map to show what happens next. So we're going to begin the same 2 colours as we've been using before, and we are going to fill in where the formations are so far based on the events from that second map. So here we are. We see the 2 armies have engaged. The English army is largely trapped between the Pelstream Burn on its right and the Bannockburn to its left and behind it. Sir Robert Keith's cavalry have just charged into the right flank of the English army, forcing the archers to scatter and to run away. So the lightly armed and armoured archers stood no chance against Keith's charge. They flee backwards into their own ranks, and that helps to spread confusion and panic amongst the wider English force. So, hemmed in on three sides by the gullies of the Pell Stream and the Bannockburn, and with Bruce's pikemen or spearmen pushing the English cavalry steadily backwards, Edward's army could neither move or bring the bulk of their fresh infantry into the battle. The English knights are well armoured and they do not go down easily. Even though they've lost the benefit of the charge and that momentum that they historically relied upon to sweep aside their enemies, Bruce's forces and the crush of these spearmen are forcing these knights on horseback backwards into their own men. It's not as if they're leaving a carpet of dead English bodies behind them, which would then obviously give space for these fresh English infantry to come in and do their best to change the flow of the battle. Instead, the English horsemen are being pushed back onto their own troops. So the English are finding themselves with less and less space, and they're unable to bring fresh troops into the battle. So the balance of events is firmly swinging against them at this stage. So pressed together into one huge single unit by this lack of space, the English forces west of the Bannockburn fought on. Even now, defeat seems unavoidable. To tip the balance and finally break Edward's army, Bruce gave the signal for the small folk to charge into the battle from Coxet Hill. Now, the small folk had been positioned in a hollow probably to the north of Coxet Hill to guard the baggage of Bruce's army. These, we think, were unprofessional soldiers. They could have been Highland clansmen that have come down to add their weight to the Scottish effort against the English invasion. They could have been camp followers, basically cooks, chefs, hunters, armed with sharpened cooking utensils. Bruce doesn't want these in the front line of the fight. These men are untested, unlike the experienced veterans that he's been fighting with on campaign for the last 7 years. He can't adequately predict how they're going to perform in a battle, and that's why he doesn't use them at the start. They could have basically caused that panic or that confusion that could have led to the wider army breaking and running. It wasn't worth the risk. However, now that things are going his way, Bruce is able to commit these untested soldiers to add their weight to the battle in the hope that they will be the straw that break the camel's back. And there we see the English forces starting to fall back. And as I said, there is historical debate over who the small folk were, but exhausted and hard-pressed, the arrival of what some in the English army must have thought was a fresh army of Scots was just too much for them to bear. The retreats of the English becomes a headlong rout as English troops turned to flee from Scottish pikes. Their bottle has broken. It is time to get out with your life. You can see on our maps, the English force turns tail and starts to try to make its way back across the Bannockburn and flee the battlefield. Now, King Edward had fought bravely that day. His bodyguards, Gilles de Argentan and the Earl of Pembroke, had to force him from the battlefield. They got him away just in time. Edward and 500 knights rode out of the battle towards Stirling Castle in the hope of finding refuge. And we can see them trying to exit the fray here. Then they go, seeking refuge in an interesting place. They don't just flee back southeast towards Edinburgh and the road they came from. Instead, they go north behind Bruce's force and head for Stirling Castle. And as soon as King Edward was out of danger, Gilles de Argentan, declaring that honour would not allow him to flee, took the extremely hardcore act of turning to confront the schiltrom of Edward Bruce single-handed. Heroically, but obviously quite suicidally, he plunged into the forest of spears. Obviously did not last long. Down he goes. Edward II's withdrawal was the signal for a full-scale general flight. The retreat to the Bannockburn became a headlong rout as men tried to flee from Bruce's pikes. English defeat turned into absolute disaster. Men fled in every direction, pursued by Bruce's exultant warriors. Those trying to cross the Forth to the north of the battlefield were drowned. In the steep gorge of the Bannockburn, the press of fleeing Englishmen suffered terrible casualties. Struggling over the difficult terrain as they tried to get down the side of the gorge to cross the stream, knights were pulled from their horses while thousands of struggling foot soldiers were caught and butchered as the Scots fell on them from behind. Now, the fate of the knights here is interesting. The knights represent the lords of the English feudal army. They are the most well trained, they are the ones with the best equipment, the ones with the best kit, but they also form a very important function to feudal society. The lords, or the knights of the English army, are those with rank, title, and land. These are the men who bring other soldiers with them to answer their feudal duty and serve their king. When the English king calls out an army, he calls out his lords, and the obligation is on them to bring themselves to battle as trained professional soldiers, but also to bring their retainers and their own men with them. This is how armies are built. If the knights are lost, not only do you lose a key fighter in the army, a man of experience, skill, training, and the best equipment, you also lose, to some extent, the followers that man brings. So taking the knights out is an amazing goal for the Scots in the outcome here of the Battle of Bannockburn. Some knights are pulled down and killed, which is a loss to the fighting future potential of the English army. Some knights instead are pulled from their horses and hauled off by the Scots as captives. And Bruce and his men will be able to ransom them back to their families, ransom them back to England in the aftermath of the battle, and make a fair old mint from the bounty money. Probably would also keep the horse, the war horse, and the armour and equipment of the knight as well, which would be worth a fair bit of coin by themselves. So riding north, Edward attempted to first seek shelter with his garrison commander in Stirling Castle, Sir Philip de Mowbray. Now, honouring the terms of his deal with Edward Bruce, de Mowbray actually refused entry to his own king. Ooh, now put yourself in the shoes of Philip de Mowbray. That would have been the most awkward decision of his life. That would have been appalling. Turning aside your own king coming to seek refuge in your castle. Oh, the consequences of it are just toe curling for that man. He did make the right decision in the end, and hopefully Edward would have seen that. Edward was forced to ride back and circle the battlefield, so he has to ride back into danger with his knights, eventually escaping southeast. So he does get out towards Dunbar, back on the road towards the border with England. So although he was accused of being a traitor at the time, poor Sir Philip, de Mowbray did Edward an enormous favour on the day. If Bruce had besieged that castle after Edward had gone and sought refuge in it, it would have been inevitable that Edward would have fallen into his hands. The ransom money for that is unthinkable, and the political power as well that Bruce could have taken from that. The precedents of this are the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Sir Marmaduke Twing, one of the lead English knights, was able to escape the carnage on the north bank. And at that time of the battle, in September 1297, Stirling Castle was held by the English. Now, as the English army as a whole retreated from the defeat at Stirling Bridge, Sir Marmaduke Twing was left to hold the castle for the English cause, and he only lasted a few months, and he himself then was subsequently taken by the Scots besiegers and had to be ransomed out. So we can see that that would likely have happened to Edward had he taken refuge in that castle. He would have fallen into the hands of Bruce. So Mowbray, rather than being a traitor, has done his king a massive favour. Although at the time, that would have been a tough call. So the losses on the day. Sources vary on the numbers suffered by both sides, but it's clear that Bannockburn was very costly for the nobility of England. England lost one earl, so one of its top-ranked nobles, 27 barons and baronets, and up to 375 knights. Now, Edward, if you recall from the Bannockburn Day 1 video, as a maximum took something like 2,000 knights and nobles with him. So that is a fair percentage of his force lost, of the elite of his army. Thousands of foot soldiers also died on both sides. In particular, both the Lanercost Chronicle and the Scala Chronica of Sir Thomas Grey record thousands dying as they tried to cross the burn during the battle, particularly obviously during their flight away at the end of the struggle. So, with Edward fleeing the battlefield and escaping off down to England, that takes us to the end of the Battle of Bannockburn. Victory for the Scots against the odds. Now, it's clear to say that Bruce played a blinder. He defeated an army that was 4 times the size of his. One of the key things to his action was that charge at the start of day 2. Had he not charged down from the crest of the hill down towards the Cars and trapped the English in that space between the Pell Stream and the Bannockburn, you could have seen the English army escaping from their confines and being able to basically deploy and use their larger numbers to surround and overwhelm Bruce's smaller force. So Bruce knew what he's doing. He played a blinder and he completely took the English force by surprise. It wasn't easy though. We know that Edward II fought hard. We know that they managed to use their archers against Bruce's force, which potentially could have been deadly and could have milled his force down had Bruce not had that rapid reaction force of Sir Robert Key. So bearing in mind everything you've picked up from today's video on day 2 of the battle, plus our previous video on Bannockburn day 1, students of high history should tackle this question here. Explain why the Scottish army were victorious at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. And that's going to be worth 8 marks. So, using your notes guys, go through, find 8 reasons why Bruce and the Scots were victorious, and explain the consequences of their actions. Why or how did these different decisions and actions taken by Bruce and his men lead to the Scottish victory on the day? So that's it for today's video. Thanks very much for listening, folks.